In the year 476 AD, a boy emperor stood powerless in Ravenna. His name was Romulus Augustulus, a name heavy with irony. Romulus, founder of Rome, Augustus, its first emperor, and yet he would be its last. A Germanic general entered the palace. There was no great battle, no dramatic final stand. The empire that once ruled the known world ended quietly, or so we are told. But empires do not die in silence. They decay, they fracture, they hesitate, and sometimes they survive. Because Rome in 476 was not empty. Its cities still stood, its laws still governed millions, its roads still stretched across continents, its memory still powerful. The Western Empire was weak, but it was not dead. Corruption hollowed the Senate. Inflation poisoned the economy. Mercenaries filled the ranks of the legions. Loyalty had been replaced with wages. The Goths pressed at the borders. The Vandals controlled North Africa. Britannia had already slipped away. But none of this was irreversible. History pivoted on one fragile truth. Rome could have chosen reform. Imagine for a moment that in 476 a different man rises. Not a child emperor, not a puppet of generals, but a hardened commander, respected by the army, feared by corrupt officials, understood by the people. He does not flee. He does not negotiate surrender. He acts. The mercenary contracts are revoked. Citizenship is expanded to secure loyalty. Military service becomes honor again, not employment. Tax records are rewritten. Provincial governors are audited. Executions are public and symbolic. Rome sends a message. Decay ends now. North Africa becomes priority. Grain shipments resume under heavy escort. The Mediterranean is declared Roman waters once more. The legions are restructured. Smaller, faster, disciplined. Instead of overstretched borders, Rome fortifies defensible lines. Britannia is formally relinquished, strategically, not chaotically. Resources are concentrated in Gaul and Italia, and something remarkable happens. Stability returns, not glory, not expansion, but survival. Trade caravans resume their routes. Coinage stabilizes. Urban centers regain confidence. Rome does not conquer. Rome consolidates. And that changes everything. Because if Rome survives the 5th century, there is no power vacuum, no fractured medieval kingdoms, no centuries of feudal fragmentation. The church never rises into political dominance because the state never collapses. The concept of Europe as separate nations never forms. All of it, France, Germany, Spain, remains provincial identities within a single imperial structure. And so the question is no longer, why did Rome fall? But rather, what if it didn't? What if the greatest empire in history learned from its weakness instead of surrendering to it? In that world, the Middle Ages never begin, and the modern world is built on uninterrupted Roman foundations. This is not the story of a fallen empire. This is the story of one that refused to die. When Rome fell, Europe shattered. From its ruins rose kingdoms, from kingdoms, nations, from nations, identities. France, Germany, Spain, England. But if Rome never collapses, none of them are born. Because fragmentation begins with absence of power. If the empire survives the 5th century, there is no vacuum. No feudal lords carving territory from abandoned provinces. No medieval patchwork of rival crowns. There is only continuity. Gaul remains a province, not France. Hispania remains Hispania, not Spain. Germania remains frontier, not a unified state. Latin continues as the language of law, trade, command. It evolves, but it does not fracture. And language shapes identity. Without linguistic isolation, Europe develops as a single intellectual sphere. Ideas move freely. Trade flows uninterrupted. Infrastructure is maintained. There are still conflicts, power struggles, political rivalries, but they happen within one imperial framework, not between separate nations. Feudalism, born from insecurity and decentralization, never fully dominates. Instead of knights swearing loyalty to local lords, officers serve an imperial chain of command. Instead of fortified micro-kingdoms, there are fortified provinces. And over centuries, something profound happens. Identity becomes civic, not ethnic. You are not primarily defined by tribe or dialect. You are defined by citizenship, Roman citizenship. This changes Europe's trajectory. There is no Hundred Years' War, no Napoleonic conquest, no continental rivalry spiraling into world wars, because there is no France, no England, only Rome. Unified infrastructure expands, ports modernize, roads endure, cities remain engines of culture and economy. While our Europe spent centuries competing internally, this Europe grows accustomed to cohesion, and cohesion creates scale. When exploration begins, it begins under one authority. When expansion happens, it is not a race between crowns, but a coordinated imperial project. But unity carries its own weight. Competition fuels innovation. Division breeds urgency. Would a unified Rome accelerate progress? Or would concentrated power suppress dissent? Because in a continent without nations, opposition is not foreign, it is internal. And a single empire ruling all of Europe must decide how to manage difference, through representation or control. History remembers Rome's fall as tragedy, but perhaps fragmentation gave Europe something else: reinvention. In this alternate world, Europe never reinvents itself. It simply continues, unbroken, unchallenged, uninterrupted. And the question remains, was Rome's collapse the end of unity or the beginning of freedom? History calls it the Dark Ages, a time when cities shrank, trade faded, knowledge retreated into silence. But the darkness was not destiny. It followed collapse. When Rome fell, infrastructure failed, urban life weakened, education fragmented. Learning did not vanish overnight. It suffocated slowly. But if Rome never falls, there is no suffocation. Cities endure, roads remain intact, ports continue operating, administration persists, urban life survives, and urban life sustains knowledge. Engineers continue refining aqueducts, architects improve concrete, shipbuilders expand maritime design. Momentum does not reset, it compounds. Because Rome was already advanced, it possessed legal systems that shaped civilizations, road networks unmatched for centuries, mechanical devices, primitive but promising. Collapse interrupted progress. Remove the interruption, and progress accelerates. The Renaissance in our world was a rediscovery. But in this world, nothing is forgotten. Greek philosophy is not hidden in monasteries. It remains debated in open institutions. Medical texts are expanded, not preserved in isolation. Scholarship becomes continuous. Education institutionalizes under imperial authority. Instead of scattered monasteries guarding fragments, state academies cultivate growth. Knowledge travels the same roads as trade, and over centuries, that continuity changes the timeline. Literacy never collapses. Bureaucracy demands documentation. Administration demands precision. Communication expands naturally. Technological experimentation grows with instability. Mechanical systems improve through steady refinement. Navigation instruments become more precise. Metallurgy advances without long pauses. The scientific method, which in our world required rediscovery and rebellion, may emerge earlier. Not as defiance against dogma, but as refinement of tradition. Because the church never becomes the sole intellectual authority. The state remains dominant. Inquiry is not rebellion. It is utility, and utility is rewarded. By the year 1000 in this world, Rome may already resemble our late medieval Europe. By 1300, mechanical innovation could rival early industrial prototypes. The Industrial Revolution might not begin in the 18th century. It might begin centuries earlier. But there is a deeper question. In our world, crisis drove innovation. War accelerated metallurgy. Competition fueled exploration. Religious tension sparked philosophical change. Without prolonged darkness, does urgency fade? Does stability slow transformation? Or does continuity create the perfect foundation for deliberate, unstoppable progress? The Europe we know was forged in fragmentation. This Europe is forged in preservation. One rebuilt from loss, the other built on uninterrupted memory. The Dark Ages were not inevitable, they were consequence. Remove the fall, and you remove the darkness. But you also remove the struggle that forced Europe to reinvent itself. And sometimes, reinvention changes a civilization more than continuity ever could. In our world, exploration was a race. Spain against Portugal, England against France, empires competing for oceans they barely understood. But competition was born from division. What happens when Europe is never divided? When Rome still stands, unified, organized, powerful? There are no rival crowns chasing glory. There is one authority, one treasury, one navy, and one long-term strategy. Because Rome was not unfamiliar with scale. It controlled the Mediterranean for centuries. It mastered logistics across continents. It built roads that stitched together nations before nations existed. So when maritime technology advances, it does not advance in isolation. It advances at imperial scale. Navigation instruments improve under state sponsorship. Shipbuilding becomes standardized. Ports operate under unified command. And eventually, the Atlantic stops being a boundary. It becomes a frontier. In our timeline, Christopher Columbus sailed under Spain. In this world, there is no Spain. There is only Rome. And Rome does not gamble blindly. It calculates. Exploration becomes a coordinated imperial mission, not a desperate gamble for trade routes. Multiple fleets launch. Expeditions are mapped with precision. Settlements are planned before ships even depart. When Rome reaches the Americas, it does not arrive fragmented. It arrives organized. Road builders follow soldiers. Administrators follow settlers. Engineers follow explorers. Cities are not temporary outposts. They are extensions of the empire. Roman law crosses the ocean. Roman infrastructure crosses the ocean. Roman citizenship crosses the ocean. But here lies the shift. In our world, colonization was chaotic, driven by rivalries and private ambition. In this world, expansion is centralized. There is no competition between European powers, no colonial wars between Spain and England, no fractured scramble for territory. There is only one expanding superstate. This creates stability, but it also creates imbalance. Because when a unified Rome reaches the New World, there is no opposing European force to check its power. No balance of empires, only consolidation. Would indigenous civilizations face a slower integration or a more efficient conquest? Would Rome assimilate as it once did in Gaul and Hispania, or would scale make assimilation impossible? Because Rome's strength was not only military, it was administrative. It absorbed cultures. It offered citizenship. It turned conquered peoples into participants. If that policy extends across the Atlantic, the Americas may not become colonies. They may become provinces. And if the Americas become provinces, the center of gravity shifts. Rome is no longer Mediterranean. It becomes transatlantic. Trade flows between continents under one banner. Resources are coordinated at imperial scale. Industrial development accelerates with access to vast new lands. There are no colonial revolutions like in our world, no American War of Independence, because rebellion requires separation, and separation requires identity outside the empire. But in a world where identity has been imperial for centuries, would colonists even see themselves as separate, or would they see themselves as Romans, born overseas? And now the deeper question emerges. In our world, European rivalries shaped global politics. Balance of power defined centuries. But here, there is no balance. Only Rome. A civilization that never fractured. A navy that answers to one command. A treasury that spans continents. Would this create centuries of stability? Or would the sheer concentration of power inevitably lead to internal fracture? Because history teaches us something. The larger the empire, the harder it is to hold together. But this Rome has centuries of uninterrupted evolution. It has learned. It has adapted. It has never collapsed. So when it crosses the Atlantic, it does not export chaos. It exports continuity. And in doing so, It reshapes the planet, not as competing empires carving borders, but as one civilization expanding its horizon. The question is no longer whether Rome survives. The question becomes, can the world survive Rome? By now, Rome is no longer just a European empire. It is transatlantic, transcontinental, transoceanic. But one frontier has always remained beyond total control: the East. In our timeline, Europe fragmented while great powers rose in Asia. The Tang and Song dynasties in China, powerful caliphates across the Middle East, the Mongol expansion reshaping continents. But in this alternate world, Rome never fractured. It never retreated. It never lost cohesion. So when East and West meet, they do not meet as shifting kingdoms. They meet as giants. A unified Rome facing unified China. A continuous empire confronting ancient civilizations that never needed reinvention. Trade would not be tentative. It would be strategic. The Silk Road becomes more than a trade route. It becomes an imperial artery. Roman engineers expand infrastructure eastward. Caravans move under military protection. Ports in the Indian Ocean operate under coordinated authority. But this is not merely commerce, it is competition. Because Rome is no longer a Mediterranean power, it is a global one. And global powers inevitably test each other. Would Rome attempt Eastern expansion? Or recognize that some civilizations are better engaged through diplomacy? In our world, fragmentation limited European reach into Asia for centuries. In this world, Rome possesses scale. It has manpower, logistics, treasury, but it also has memory. Rome understands overstretch. It remembers the limits of conquest. So perhaps the relationship becomes something more complex than war, a balance of civilizations. Imagine Roman ambassadors in Chang'an, Chinese envoys in Rome, exchange of paper-making techniques centuries earlier, gunpowder studied not as curiosity, but as strategy. Technological acceleration intensifies. Maritime innovation spreads across continents. Navigation becomes more precise. Cartography becomes global. But balance is fragile. Because when two super civilizations coexist, there are only two outcomes: cooperation or confrontation. And if confrontation emerges, it would not be medieval skirmishes. It would be industrial-scale conflict, centuries early. A world where Rome and the East compete not as nations, but as civilizations. And then there is another force: religion. In our timeline, Christianity reshaped Rome after its fragmentation. Islam rose across former Roman territories. Faith became geopolitical. But in a Rome that never collapsed, religious authority may never dominate political authority. The state remains supreme. Religious movements are integrated, regulated, absorbed. Without fragmentation, there is no power vacuum for faith to control empires. Which means global conflict may be less ideological and more strategic. Trade routes, territory, influence. Not crusades, not holy wars, but imperial calculation. And this changes the shape of global history. No east-west schism, no centuries-long stagnation along fractured borders. Instead, a prolonged equilibrium between massive civilizations. A multipolar world, but with fewer poles. Rome, China, perhaps India, perhaps emerging African powers integrated into Roman trade networks. The modern concept of nation-states may never dominate global politics. Instead, the world organizes around civilizations, massive, centralized, enduring systems. And here lies the deeper question: would this world be more stable or more dangerous? Because when smaller nations clash, wars are contained. But when civilizations collide, the scale is unimaginable. A Rome that never fell would not fear the East, but it would respect it. And respect can prevent war, or delay it. As centuries pass, technology advances, communication improves, naval power expands. Eventually, oceans no longer separate empires, they connect them. And in that moment, the world becomes truly global. Not through colonial competition, not through fragmented exploration, but through structured imperial engagement. Rome does not stand alone at the top. It stands across from equals. And history becomes not a story of Western dominance, but a negotiation between enduring powers. The fall of Rome shaped the West. But if Rome never fell, the entire balance between East and West changes. And perhaps the greatest transformation of all is not who dominates, but how power is shared. History is not just what happened, it is what could have happened. If you want to explore the turning points that shaped our world and the alternate paths history never took, subscribe to Echoes History, because the past still echoes and the next story is already waiting. In our world, the Industrial Revolution began in 18th century Britain. Steam engines, coal, factories rising beside rivers. But industrialization did not appear from nothing. It was the product of accumulated knowledge and centuries of competition. Now imagine a different timeline, a world where Rome never collapsed, where infrastructure never decayed, where literacy never fell, where engineering never paused. Because Rome already understood scale. It mastered concrete, built aqueducts across valleys, engineered roads that endured for millennia. It created systems, and systems are the foundation of industry. In our timeline, progress had to be rediscovered. In this world, it simply evolves. Water mills expand in number and efficiency. Mechanical gearing improves gradually. Metallurgy refines through continuous experimentation. There is no medieval stagnation, no centuries lost to fragmentation. Urban centers remain intact. Cities grow larger, not smaller. And cities demand energy. Energy demands innovation. The steam engine in our world was born from necessity. In this world, necessity arrives earlier. Because a unified Rome manages vast territories. It moves grain across oceans, troops across continents, materials across provinces. Efficiency becomes survival. Engineers begin experimenting with pressure systems. Hydraulic knowledge deepens. Mechanical pumps become more advanced. And eventually, steam is not curiosity. It becomes application. Not in a fragmented Britain, but across an empire. Imagine factories rising not in isolated cities, but in coordinated networks. Iron production centralized. Shipbuilding accelerated, textile manufacturing scaled under imperial oversight. But something crucial changes here. In our world, industrialization was competitive. Nations raced to dominate production. Competition fueled speed. In this world, there are no rival European states. There is one authority, one centralized system. This creates enormous scale, but less internal rivalry. Does this slow innovation? Or does unified coordination make it unstoppable? Because when industry is directed by empire, it becomes strategic. Rail-like transport systems may emerge earlier. Steam-powered naval fleets dominate oceans sooner. Communication networks expand faster. A transcontinental empire industrializes as one body. And once industrial power emerges, everything changes. Military strength multiplies. Production capacity explodes. Global influence becomes overwhelming. Rome is no longer ancient, it is modern. And modernization without fragmentation creates a different kind of world. In our timeline, industrialization led to class upheaval, urban overcrowding, labor movements, revolutions. But in this Rome, political authority never disappeared. The state remains strong. Would it adapt to industrial society or suppress unrest? Because industry reshapes power, it creates new wealth, new classes, new demands. A Rome that survived antiquity must now survive modernity, and survival demands reform. Perhaps the empire evolves into representation. Perhaps provincial voices gain influence. Perhaps citizenship expands again. Or perhaps control tightens. Because centralized power amplified by industry is unmatched. Factories feed armies. Steam feeds fleets. Steel feeds conquest. And by the time the rest of the world industrializes, Rome has already perfected it. The Industrial Revolution reshaped our world, but in this timeline, it reshapes a world already unified, which means the question is no longer who leads the modern age. The question is whether anyone can challenge it. Because an industrialized Rome is not merely an empire, it is a machine. And machines, once built, do not easily stop. For centuries, Rome endured. It survived collapse, It mastered oceans. It industrialized before the world was ready. It became a machine. But every machine carries stress, and the larger it grows, the greater the pressure within. In our timeline, Rome fell from external invasion and internal decay. In this world, external threats were contained, but internal tension never disappears. Because unity, over time, becomes weight. An empire spanning continents must govern millions, then billions. It must balance prosperity with control. Industry accelerates wealth, but wealth creates classes. Factories generate production, but also inequality. Urban centers expand rapidly. Workers demand representation. Merchants demand influence. Provincial elites demand autonomy. For centuries, loyalty to Rome was identity. Citizenship was privilege. But as generations pass, identity shifts. A Roman born in distant provinces may begin to ask a dangerous question. If we are all Rome, who truly rules? The capital remains powerful. The Senate evolves, or resists evolution. The emperor, symbolic or absolute, must adapt to modernity. Because industrial power changes politics. Rail networks connect distant provinces. Communication becomes instantaneous. Ideas travel faster than legions ever could. Dissent no longer whispers. It spreads. And a unified empire faces a paradox. Its greatest strength, scale, is also its greatest vulnerability. In smaller nations, unrest can be isolated. In a global empire, unrest is contagious. A strike in one province affects supply chains across continents. A protest in one city echoes through others. A failed harvest in one region destabilizes distant markets. The system is efficient, but efficiency removes buffers. The question becomes not whether Rome can conquer, but whether Rome can adapt. Will it reform politically, grant broader representation, decentralize power while maintaining unity, or will it tighten control? Because industrial strength paired with centralized authority creates something unprecedented. Surveillance, rapid troop deployment, information control. A Rome that once relied on roads and messengers now commands telegraph lines and steam fleets. Control becomes easier, but resistance becomes smarter. And over time, a quiet transformation begins. The empire no longer defines itself by expansion. It defines itself by preservation, by managing complexity, by preventing fracture. Because the greatest threat to a civilization that never fell is stagnation. If innovation slows, others will catch up. If reform stalls, loyalty erodes. If identity weakens, unity dissolves. In our world, Rome collapsed and gave birth to nations. In this world, Rome survives, but survival demands constant reinvention. And perhaps that is the final lesson. No empire is tested only by enemies. It is tested by its own success, by the weight of its own scale, by the expectations of those it governs. Rome refused to fall in 476. It conquered oceans. It industrialized. It reshaped the globe. But now, centuries later, it faces a different battle. Not against barbarians, not against rival empires, but against time, against complexity, against the quiet erosion of unity. Because when an empire never collapses, it must constantly evolve, or risk becoming too large to sustain itself. And the greatest question of all remains, can a civilization that never fragmented learn how to change without first breaking? For centuries, Rome faced outward. It crossed oceans. It industrialized. It balanced east and west. But now, the greatest threat no longer stands beyond its borders. It stands within them. Because a world dominated by one civilization does not eliminate conflict. It internalizes it. In our timeline, global wars erupted from rivalry. Germany against Britain, empires colliding, alliances forming and breaking. But here, there are no rival European superpowers. There is no continental balance of power. There is only Rome. And when a single system controls continents, conflict does not disappear. It scales. Industrialization has armed the empire with unimaginable force. Steam-powered fleets patrol oceans. Rail systems move legions in days. Factories produce weapons at unprecedented speed. But technology does not guarantee stability. It amplifies division. As provinces grow wealthier, as distant regions gain population and influence, a dangerous idea begins to spread: autonomy. Not rebellion against Rome, but reinterpretation of Rome. Some provinces demand decentralization, others push for expanded representation. Industrial elites seek greater political voice. And then comes the fracture point. Not a barbarian invasion, not a foreign empire, but ideology. Should Rome remain centralized, a single, unyielding authority, or evolve into a federated structure? History shows us something unsettling. When reform is delayed, revolution accelerates. And in an empire this vast, even limited unrest can ignite chains of consequence. Imagine coordinated strikes across continents. Imagine regional governors refusing imperial directives. Imagine industrial centers withholding production. The empire that once mastered logistics now faces logistical paralysis. Legions may remain loyal, but loyalty strains under uncertainty. And if conflict erupts, it will not resemble ancient civil wars. It will be mechanized. Rail lines turned into supply arteries. Factories converted entirely to wartime production. Steam fleets blockading internal provinces. A war not between nations, a war within one civilization. And that changes everything. Because civil wars do not redraw borders easily. They fracture identity. If Rome fights Rome, the myth of eternal unity shatters. The empire that never fell may not collapse from invasion. It may divide from within. But here lies the deeper possibility. Perhaps Rome learns from its ancient past. Perhaps reform arrives just in time. Representation expands. Provincial councils gain authority. Citizenship evolves once again. Because survival has always required adaptation. And Rome's greatest strength, across centuries, was not conquest. It was flexibility. If it adapts, it becomes something new. Not a rigid empire, but a continental federation. A superstate refined through crisis. If it fails, then the fall delayed for centuries finally arrives. Not as barbarian conquest, but as fragmentation. And that fragmentation would reshape the globe. Because the world has grown dependent on Rome. Trade routes, industrial output, military balance. If Rome fractures, power vacuums emerge everywhere. And for the first time in this alternate history, the planet experiences something unfamiliar: multipolar chaos. The irony is profound. Rome survived the 5th century. It mastered industry. It conquered oceans. Yet the question remains the same as it was in antiquity. Can unity endure forever? Or is fragmentation not a tragedy, but a phase every civilization must eventually face? In this world, the global war is not Rome versus the world. It is Rome versus itself. And the outcome will determine whether history continues as continuity or finally breaks. The year is not 476. It is 2026, and Rome still stands. Not as a memory, not as ruins, but as the most powerful political entity on Earth. Centuries of uninterrupted evolution have transformed it. The marble forums remain, but glass towers rise behind them. Ancient roads have become high-speed transit corridors. Aqueducts gave birth to global infrastructure networks. The eagle still flies, but now above satellites. Because a civilization that never fell never had to rebuild. It only had to adapt. In our world, modern nation-states define politics: borders, passports, national identities. But in this world, citizenship has been imperial for over 2,000 years. A Roman may be born in former Gaul, in North Africa, in the Americas, or in Asia. Yet the identity is shared, not tribal, not national, civilizational. The empire likely evolved long ago into a federated superstate: provincial senates, regional autonomy, central coordination, too vast for absolute monarchy, too unified for fragmentation. It is not ancient Rome. It is a post-industrial Roman federation. Technology flourished earlier. Global infrastructure matured sooner. Energy networks span continents. Transportation links oceans seamlessly. And perhaps most critically, global war never defined the 20th century. No world wars between rival European empires. No Cold War dividing continents. Because Rome remained the anchor. There may have been conflicts, internal crises, reform movements, but not continent-wide annihilation between rival states, which means the modern world looks different. No fractured Europe rebuilding after devastation, no competing superpowers dividing the globe into blocks. Instead, the world organized around a few enduring civilizations: Rome, China, possibly a unified Indian sphere. Power balances exist, but not through dozens of nation-states, through massive civilizational entities. And what of culture? Would diversity survive inside such a vast system? History suggests yes. Rome's ancient strength was assimilation. It allowed local identity to coexist with imperial loyalty. In the 21st century, that model may be perfected. Languages preserved, cultures celebrated, but governance coordinated. The internet exists, but it developed under centralized oversight. Information flows freely, but within regulatory structure. A Rome that survived millennia would not fear technology. It would integrate it. And perhaps here lies the final transformation. In our world, power shifts constantly. Empires rise and fall. Instability drives reinvention. In this world, continuity shaped stability. The question is no longer whether Rome survives. It has proven it can. The question becomes, does permanence create prosperity, or does it quietly limit possibility? Because fragmentation, painful as it was, gave birth to diversity of states, competition, rapid innovation through rivalry. A unified Rome may have prevented catastrophe, but it may also have prevented certain revolutions, political experiments, radical shifts in ideology. This 21st century is stable, coordinated, immense, but perhaps less chaotic, less explosive, less unpredictable. The eagle still flies, not over ruins, but over a world reshaped by continuity. And as citizens walk through streets where ancient stone meets modern steel, they may not ask how Rome survived. They may ask something far more profound. Was the fall of Rome a tragedy in our world, or was it the spark that made our world possible? In this timeline, Rome never fell, and the modern age was built not from fragments, but from endurance. Rome did not fall. Not in 476, not in rebellion, not in fire, not in silence. It endured, it adapted, it evolved. For 2,000 years, the eagle never descended, cities never emptied, roads never crumbled, knowledge never disappeared into monasteries. Industry arrived early, oceans were crossed sooner. The modern age began under marble arches. In this world, history was not reborn from ashes. It was built on continuity. But here is the final question. Was that a blessing or a limitation? Because in our world, Rome's fall shattered unity, and from those fragments emerged nations, competition, rivalries, innovation driven by fear and ambition. The Renaissance rose from rediscovery. The Enlightenment challenged authority. Revolutions redefined power. Chaos gave birth to transformation. In this alternate world, Rome never fractured. Stability replaced fragmentation. Coordination replaced rivalry. Continuity replaced reinvention. And perhaps that created something powerful. A world with fewer world wars, fewer collapsing states, fewer centuries of darkness, but also fewer radical breaks, fewer unpredictable leaps. Because when a civilization survives uninterrupted, it evolves carefully, deliberately. It does not explode forward, it expands methodically. So what kind of world stands before us now? A unified Roman Federation, ancient symbols etched into spacecraft, Latin phrases encoded into digital systems, an imperial identity stretching across continents. No dramatic fall, no medieval reset, no shattered Europe rebuilding from ruins, just endurance. But history teaches something profound. Nothing lasts unchanged. Even the empire that never fell must constantly transform, or it becomes too heavy to carry itself. And maybe that is the ultimate truth. Rome's fall in our world was not merely destruction, it was release. It allowed the world to diversify, to experiment, to compete, to fracture and rebuild in unpredictable ways. The Rome that never fell gave humanity stability. The Rome that did fall gave humanity volatility. And volatility fuels possibility. So as we stand at the end of this imagined timeline, we are left with one haunting realization. The fall of Rome was not simply the end of an empire, it was the beginning of the modern world. Remove the fall, and you reshape everything: politics, technology, war, identity. But you also remove the catalyst that forced humanity to reinvent itself. Rome never fell in this story, but perhaps its fall, in our world, was history's greatest turning point. Not because Rome failed, but because from its ruins, the world we know was born. And that may be the greatest paradox of all. Sometimes an empire must fall so that the future can rise. History is not just a record of the past. It is a collection of turning points, choices that shape the world we know today. But for every path that was taken, countless others were left behind. And in those forgotten possibilities, history still whispers. This is Echo's History, where the past is never truly silent.